on the topic of doing nothing and non-action. So, I think that there's a misunderstanding when it comes down to this. I think that when people think about doing nothing, they think that they need to sit still and do nothing in that sense of just like not doing anything, or they need to stop thinking, and they need to stop action altogether. And it's not really about that. Like, when it comes down to non-action and doing nothing, it's not about literally doing nothing. It's more about being the non-doer. And so it's about coming into identification with yourself, where you realize that it isn't you that is doing all these things. It's a conditioned response mechanism that's doing things through you, generally. And then once you become conscious, then you become the non-doer, in the sense that you're not attached to any of the things that you're doing. So you have no attachment to any of the outcomes of what you are performing, or the actions that you're performing. Even meditation, when you sit down and meditate, a lot of people think that it's all about just stopping thinking, or just not thinking anything, or just being blank altogether. And it's not about being blank. It's about having a complete focus on God, or a complete focus on the sense of being in the moment. But if you think about it like this, right? Like, when I've experienced meditation, the first many times that I ever experienced meditation was not from sitting and meditating. It was from walking and chanting. And then eventually I got to a point where the rhythm of the feet moving back and forth and the sounds coming through put me in a space where I was no longer saying the words, and I was no longer hearing the music, and I was no longer walking my feet. They were all just doing themselves. And I was just sitting there being in this state of bliss. Like, I was just experiencing myself walking, chanting, and singing, and moving from point A to point B, but not being the one moving from point A to point B. I wasn't the one who was doing it. I was just observing myself doing it. So non-action is not about actually forcing yourself to not think or to not do anything. It's about getting yourself to where you don't identify or cling on to any of the actions that you're doing, to a point where you just become the observer of the actions happening. And then deeper than that, once you start to be the observer, it's not like you're detached completely from the things, because you're obviously still experiencing your body sensations, your bodily sensations, you're experiencing all these different things. But what happens is that your consciousness goes somewhere else. Like, your consciousness becomes absorbed in experience itself and not in what you are experiencing. So it's like you start to realize that, like, that there's a space beyond what you're doing where it's more like what you're being. And then you can focus your energy onto being what you want to be. And it's not what you want to be, it's being what God wants you to be, beyond what you're doing. And then, because so many people are conditionalized to what they're doing, so they'll start to say go to work, and they'll go do their job, and then they'll start being the person who's working, doing the job, and then they become miserable because they don't want to be the person working, doing the job. They want to be somebody who's happy, or somebody who's being happy. And so they disconnect themselves from their own inner joy by literally becoming something that they're not. In reality, they're not a person working. They are an infinite being a person who's working. So they lose their identity of who they really are. So when it says non-action and non-doership, it's really talking about not identifying yourself with what you're doing and finding what it is that you actually are and being that. And so the non-doer is still doing things, but they're just not identified with being the person who's doing the things. And therefore they're not identified with what results come from doing the things. And because really the suffering is incurred, or it comes from being result oriented, desiring specific things, and then having your desires be not fulfilled. So suffering comes from a person who thinks that life should go this way, this way, this way, and this way, and then they experience life going this way, and then they feel tension between their idea of what they think that life should be and what life is actually being, and then all of a sudden they experience suffering because they're not in the flow of life. They're not experiencing themselves as being in resonance with what's going on. They have a different idea in their mind about what they think should be happening. So meditation would be to be able to allow the mind. See, it's interesting because what happens is that you start to have thoughts, and like at first the thoughts are going to flow through, but it's not really about you stopping thoughts. It's more about you stopping your identification with thoughts. So you stop having these kinds of ideas in your mind that make you cling on to them, and then go into these storylines, and then start projecting yourself into all these different experiences, and just like you basically are able to observe the different flows of thoughts coming through, and then start to choose what you would identify with. So for me, say like these, because like at this point now for me, I can feel what thoughts are mine and what thoughts are other people's, and I can also feel, when I say mine, it's like I don't even really identify with my own thoughts. I just choose whichever ones feel good to me. So say all these other random things could come through my head, but I, instead of thinking, oh my gosh, because I thought this thought, that's me and that's who I am, I realize that thoughts are just flows of energy, and sometimes in order to go from one place to another, you got to walk through traffic. And so like I don't identify myself with the traffic, otherwise I'd be getting hit by cars all the time, and then I'd be injured. So I just wait for the traffic to stop and then walk across the street, and then next thing you know, the traffic's gone and you're in somewhere else. You're like in the woods where there is no more traffic. And then instead of you having to, like imagine if you were trying to walk across the street and you literally started trying to stop every single car and talk to the person in every single car. Like, it would make it impossible for you to walk across the street because you would never be able to actually get where you're trying to go. And so like people get so distracted with entertaining the thoughts that come through their mind that they don't realize that that's not what the point of it is. Like, you're not trying to, the thoughts are there for reference. Like, it's like you can choose to identify with them or you can let them go based on what you would like to experience. So many people are so accustomed to drama, and they've been basically indoctrinated by everybody else around them that like they literally think that if they think a thought, then that's theirs, and that means that they need to identify with that and they need to go along with that story the same way that they've basically been pushed into stories their entire life. But in reality, you don't even have to identify with any thoughts at all. And eventually what happens is once you stop identifying with them, they stop clinging on to you and they stop happening. And if you stop identifying with all the thoughts, then eventually your mind just becomes blank for long periods of time, and you just sit, and you can just sit and there, the one thing I did notice is that my mind was blank, and then all of a sudden I had a thought about what I was going to say next. And I started hearing the bird at the same time. So those were really the only things that were going on. And, but before, like, as soon as they, like, it really is possible to just not be thinking about anything. It's just the fact that, like, I just don't identify with the thoughts that come through, so they just don't even, it's almost like background noise. Like some people get really disturbed by honking sounds. outside, say that you were living in New York City and you are disturbed by honking noises, then you were going to be really messed up by the time you're done living there, because of the fact that there's just honking noises going on all the time. So eventually you get to a point where you just stop responding to honking noises. And so it's like, it's not like they're not there, I guess, but they're so quiet in the background that you just don't even notice it, and it's just not even there anymore for you. So it's like, meditation is about being able to focus your attention on what it is that you want to experience, and focus your attention on one particular thing at a time. And then it's not even a thing. It's like, well, if you want to focus on nothing, then what you have to do is you have to focus on letting go of every single thing that comes into your consciousness, and literally just focus your attention on, say, the feeling of happiness, or the feeling of contentment, or the feeling of peace, or just like focus on something that has no form to it. You know, like, so the feeling of happiness or contentment doesn't have a form unless you project a form onto it. And so it's like, a lot of people even project forms onto happiness and contentment. They're like, oh, I feel content whenever I'm doing this and this. And it's like, no, it's not about that. It's like, what is that feeling in yourself? What is the feeling of contentment? And it's like, once you realize what the feeling of contentment is, then it's not subject to doing something. It's just the feeling. That's all it is. So you just focus on that feeling, and then you completely disregard everything else. And eventually you'll get really good at being able to take your attention and focus it just on that feeling, rather than having to play some storyline out inside of your consciousness in order to be able to make yourself feel that feeling. But these are just little forms of meditation. But like, I know I started with non-doership and all this other stuff, but like, all this stuff kind of comes together. It's all part of one thing. So like, the non-doer is the person who's just not identified with what they're doing, and they're not identified with the fruits of their actions, and they're not identified with any side